Welcome back to the deep dive. So you've handed us quite a stack of sources today. It really feels like essential reading for anyone trying to push a genuinely new, maybe disruptive idea without, getting completely run over by the system.
That's a perfect way to put it. That's really the core mission today. We're doing a deep dive into the strategies, the real tactics needed to successfully champion these nonconformist ideas. How do you actually overcome that organizational inertia and that ever-present groupthink?
Yeah, the twin foes.
Exactly. We're basically looking at the survival guide for the original, that person who actually dares to innovate, to do something different.
And it's quite a journey you've mapped out. We're pulling together insights from, well, all over the place.
Yeah.
Ancient political thinkers like Aristotle, Thucydides, military strategy from Sun Tzu and Clausewitz, and then right up to, modern classics, corporate must-reads like Ed Catmull's Creativity, Inc., Jim Collins' Good to Great.
Yeah, and what really ties this huge range of thinking together is this one central paradox. If you want real innovation, you have to welcome dissent. You have to tolerate sometimes spectacular failures, champion ideas that honestly look pretty broken at first.
Right.
But the question is, and this is the tricky part, how do you actually introduce that disruptive, maybe even controversial idea without just getting shut down immediately or, ostracized? How do you avoid being seen as just a threat to the very system you're trying to improve, maybe even save?
That balancing act.
That delicate balance, that's what we really need to unpack for you today.
Okay, so let's dig in. Where do most of these original ideas tend to die off? You're saying it's the environment itself.
Often, yes. The biggest hurdle isn't usually people being malicious or, frankly, stupid. It's more the organization's own relentless drive for continuity. It's almost biological.
Okay, let's start there then. Part one. The culture of candor versus the beast of production.
Right. The first thing we have to get our heads around is that for any organization, or really any person trying to make a big change, knowledge itself isn't enough. It's only valuable when it's understood and applied.
Sure.
But actually applying genuinely new knowledge, that means you have to confront these massive, often kind of invisible forces that are basically designed, sometimes unintentionally, to block inspiration.
And in the creative world, these forces actually have a name, right? The beast.
Yeah.
This comes straight from Ed Catmull at Pixar, talking about building that company and then crucially integrating it into Disney animation.
Exactly. The beast, it's any large, successful, established group. And the irony is, success makes the beast hungrier, not satisfied. Think about Disney animation after huge hits like The Lion King. Global phenomenon.
Yeah, massive.
That success immediately justifies this sprawling infrastructure, huge teams, specialized departments, a giant operation.
So it's the sheer overhead that becomes the monster, isn't it? The leadership might have the best intentions, wanting to keep the artistic quality high, but that success creates this constant hunger. It demands this uninterrupted flow of new material just to keep the lights on, justify the head count.
The beast can't really pause. It needs feeding. And that leads to the inevitable outcome. The pressure to create and to create quickly and predictably. It just constantly pushes down the overall quality.
Even with good intentions?
Even with good intentions. The organization gets tied to predictable output because the risk, the cost of real disruption feels too high. So the goal slowly shifts from let's make something amazing to, well, let's just feed the machine.
Okay, so if the organization is constantly demanding safe, predictable stuff, how does a truly breakthrough, maybe non-conformist idea even stand a chance? That's where the ugly baby comes in, I guess.
The ugly baby, it's such a brilliant metaphor. It's acknowledging that breakthrough creation is just inherently hard and inconsistent. Catmull points out that the two things you absolutely need to tolerate genuine breakthroughs and total fallacies, they look almost identical at the beginning. A really disruptive idea. It's almost never born perfect. It's usually awkward, kind of unformed, maybe even unattractive at first glance, like an ugly baby.
That is a tough sell, though. How do you convince the leadership or maybe a board to invest in something that looks awkward and unformed, especially when, like you said, the beast is roaring for safe returns?
You have to fundamentally shift how they think about outcomes. The distribution of results. This sounds a bit technical, but it's absolutely critical. Most corporate settings, they implicitly assume what's called a truncated outcome distribution.
Meaning there's a cap on success.
Yeah, exactly. Like in baseball, right?
Yeah.
Step up to the plate. The best you can usually do is 4 runs, maybe. There's a limit. But in truly creative or disruptive fields, the distribution is non-truncated.
So no limit.
Essentially. While most of your attempts, your at-bats, might result in 0, maybe 1 run, Occasionally, just occasionally, you step up, and the outcome is so massive that metaphorically you can score 1,000 runs.
Wow.
The payoff from that one breakthrough completely covers the cost of dozens, maybe hundreds of failures. So if you want those sky-high, non-truncated mega-hits, you must be prepared to tolerate a proportional amount of lows, of failures, of ugly babies.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense mathematically, but it requires a huge dose of organizational humility, doesn't it? If a leader thinks every past success was purely down to their own genius, they're not going to want to risk any lows, any ugly babies.
That's absolutely right. The sources really stress this. Attributing success only to your own brilliance actually diminishes us. It stops leaders from accepting the huge role that random chance, luck, accidental events play. Like Disney's own internal struggles actually making the Pixar merger possible.
Right, things you couldn't plan for.
If you believe your success is 100% because you're a genius, you become terrified of anything that even hints you might fail this time.
And that lack of humility just chains the whole organization to the status quo, right? It
Yeah.
fosters this deep-seated, pervasive fear of change. You see it historically when people try to replicate past genius, asking, what would Walt do at Disney? Or like Steve Jobs explicitly warned Apple not to do, asking, what would Steve do?
Precisely. That kind of backward-looking approach, it guarantees the organization stays intellectually frozen. It actively avoids the necessary, often uncomfortable creative dissent that's needed to challenge those old ways. After the Disney merger, the atmosphere inside Disney Animation was described like a dog that had been beaten again and again. People were just paralyzed. They were afraid to pour their hearts into something new because they feared it wouldn't succeed based on past failures, and maybe feared personal consequences too.
So if the team is basically internally terrified, the leader's job becomes incredibly specific. They have to somehow build a culture of candor where people feel safe enough to actually bring out those ugly babies.
They absolutely have to. But, and this is key, the leader must make a sharp distinction between attacking the idea and attacking the person. The goal has to be creating a kind of crucible that boils away everything that's not working from the project itself,
Okay.
while fiercely protecting the person who had the courage to bring that flawed, maybe ugly idea forward in the first place. That crucible demands absolute, almost brutal honesty, which, let's face it, runs completely counter to the usual corporate desire for politeness and harmony.
Okay, so that's the cultural backdrop. Let's bridge that now to what actually happens, or doesn't happen, in the room when ideas are discussed. Part 2. Overcoming groupthink and institutional fear.
Right. So we understand the need for this crucible of honesty, but building a culture where that can actually exist, it needs a foundation of psychological safety. And as the research on team dysfunction shows, that safety, that mutual respect, is often the very first thing to crumble.
And the sign of that crumbling is often really small, isn't it? Like the example of Mikey, the team member who just rolled her eyes when a colleague shared an idea. Seems minor, but it's toxic.
It's absolute poison, because that eye roll, it wasn't just, disagreeing. It was a symptom of Mikey feeling deeper down that her own expertise wasn't being valued or appreciated by the team. She felt slighted, disrespected, and that immediately breaks the basic social contract needed for a functional team.
And once that respect is gone, the whole dynamic just tanks, doesn't it? It shifts from potentially productive tension over the idea to just personal conflict. The emotions switch from, say, fear of a bad outcome for the project, which can be useful, to just anger at feeling personally attacked or ignored.
That's exactly when you see the classic dysfunctions kick in. People pouting, maybe name-calling under their breath, making veiled threats. The focus shifts completely away from the shared goal, the mutual purpose of solving the problem, and it becomes all about scoring points against each other.
But as dangerous as that open conflict is, you mentioned something even more insidious earlier. The quiet, the silence.
Yes, the cost of silence. The Crucial Conversations material really hammers this home. Dissent completely fails when people just stay on the surface level. They hold back their real thoughts, their doubts, often because they're trying to read the leader, trying to figure out what the leader wants to hear.
And we have that almost unbelievable example from the screening of that project, American Dog. The sources describe it as just spiraling into total creative chaos.
Chaos is putting it mildly. The plot, as I recall, eventually involved, was it a radioactive, cookie-selling Girl Scout zombie serial killer?
Laughing slightly. Yeah, something like that. I mean, completely off the rails creatively, utterly unhinged.
Exactly. And yet, when the directors, the animators, the whole team gathered for the screening review, the feedback was described as strangely upbeat.
No way.
Yes. Everyone in that room knew the project was deeply, maybe fatally flawed. But nobody wanted to be the first one to say the emperor had no clothes. They held back, probably convinced that raising real concerns would be seen as disloyal, maybe even career suicide.
That kind of forced positivity, where people are literally afraid to trust their own gut feelings,
Yeah.
it just guarantees failure, doesn't it? The leader there, John Lasseter, he had to confront it directly.
He did. He apparently demanded right then and there that if they ever resorted to that kind of superficial, polite avoidance again, quote, we'd be finished as a studio.
Wow, high stakes.
It was a necessary confrontation, maybe even a bit theatrical, but it sent a clear message. The leader valued honesty, even brutally difficult honesty, far more than politeness or just telling him what they thought he wanted to hear. It apparently took real, vigilant coaching afterwards, pulling aside those who were always hesitant, forcing them to engage fully, even if it meant risking conflict over those ugly babies.
Okay, so let's say a leader manages that. They break the silence, force the honesty. Is there another trap waiting, like maybe getting stuck in endless debate?
Absolutely. The paralysis of over-deliberation. This is a really powerful, almost ancient piece of wisdom. We look to Confucius, right? He commented on this leader, Zhuangzi, who was famous because he thought about every action 3 times before he did anything.
Sounds prudent.
Sounds prudent, but the master, Confucius, apparently cut him down a bit, saying, twice would suffice.
Twice. That's quite pointed. It's like a rejection of organizational perfectionism, isn't it? It suggests that spending too much time analyzing every single risk, trying to get 100% certainty, that itself becomes a barrier to taking necessary, maybe even radical action. The idea that you can solve all the problems of an ugly baby before you even start moving. It's a fantasy.
It's a complete fantasy.
Yeah.
And it's often fed by a lack of internal focus or clarity. To break through that inertia, that status quo, and overcome the temptation to just keep analyzing forever, you need a really strong internal compass, or what Stephen Covey calls having a bigger yes burning inside.
The bigger yes, that core principle that gives you the strength to say no to other things.
Exactly. Without that powerful, principle-centered yes, it's almost impossible to say no to all the urgent but ultimately unimportant tasks that flood our days, the classic quadrant 3 activities.
Right, the urgent, not important stuff.
That's where most organizations waste so much time and energy, right? Constantly checking email, going to pointless meetings, dealing with superficial crises that feel productive but actually achieve very little of long-term value.
They fill the day, they make you feel busy, but they're the enemy of real innovation. They stop you from carving out time for the truly important, but not necessarily urgent, quadrant 2 activities, that deep work, the strategic thinking, needed to actually nurture an ugly baby into a real breakthrough.
And just willpower alone often isn't enough to resist that pull of the urgent. You need that bigger yes, centered on a core principle, to give you the courage to risk disruption, to say no, and to focus on what truly matters long term.
Okay, this brings us to needing support. Once an original leader has that breakthrough idea, maybe nurture the ugly baby a bit and starts getting some momentum. They inevitably need allies, right, to push the idea out there. But you're saying this is where things get really treacherous. Part 3, the strategic dangers of coalition building.
Yes, history offers some really harsh lessons here. Alliances, counterintuitively, can often be more dangerous than having open enemies.
The analysis of the suffrage movement is a fascinating case study, almost like a corporate metaphor for this danger. You have Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony operating initially under this assumption that basically anyone who supported suffrage, even slightly, was a friend.
And that really broad, kind of undiscerning approach, it cost them dearly. Their alliance with George Francis Train, who was a pretty controversial figure, held some deeply prejudiced views.
Right.
It ended up associating their cause, suffrage, with views that many potential supporters found completely repulsive. And the sources suggest this directly contributed to them losing a critical vote on suffrage in Kansas.
And it didn't stop there, did it? Their later alliance with Victoria Woodhull was even more problematic from a strategic perspective.
Much more. Woodhull advocated for things like extreme sexual freedom, ran for president on a very radical platform. Her agenda was so far beyond the specific goal of suffrage that it just muddied the waters completely. It cast this dark cloud over the entire movement, as the source puts it.
So the insight here for someone trying to champion an original idea today is what? Be ruthless about who you align with.
It's about the danger of association, really. By defining ally way too broadly, Stanton and Anthony linked their focused mission, just getting the vote, with all sorts of other extreme views. They undermine their own cause through guilt by association. So yes, coalition building requires incredible focus, sometimes really cold calculation about who helps and who hurts, regardless of stated support.
Okay, if we want cold calculation, we inevitably turn to Machiavelli. His view on coalitions is purely about self-preservation and, well, what works.
Machiavelli gives very practical, if somewhat chilling, advice to a new leader, a new prince. Don't rely on sentiment, rely on strategy. He says, basically, try to become the leader and defender of your less powerful neighbors, while actively working to weaken the more powerful ones around you.
It's constant balancing act.
It's a constant strategic rebalancing. The goal is to make sure no single ally ever gets strong enough to actually challenge you or hijack your agenda.
And the story of Castruccio Castracani illustrates this perfectly, doesn't it? He rose to power in Lucca, initially with critical help from a powerful local family, the Poggios. They were essential early allies.
Absolutely essential. But later, when the Poggios felt like they weren't getting their due share of power and led a revolt against him, Castracani, after crushing the rebellion, didn't offer forgiveness or try to reconcile.
No.
He immediately had the entire Poggio family executed. His reasoning, their ambition meant they could never, ever be truly trusted again.
And then, just to drive the point home, he built a fortress using the stones from their dismantled towers. The symbolism is just brutal. Your own survival or the survival of your core idea has to come first. And powerful allies, precisely because of their ambition, are often the biggest long-term threat.
Now, this purely expedient approach creates a massive tension with, say, classical ethics. You look at someone like Cicero, he argued that, yes, certain things are right by nature, keeping promises, sticking to agreements. But he also acknowledged that sometimes, due to a change of expediency, fulfilling those commitments might become wrong.
But for Cicero, that change of expediency was tied to a higher duty, right? The duty to the state, the common good.
Exactly. Whereas for the Machiavellian prince, or by extension the ruthless original leader fighting for survival, that change is tied much more directly to preserving the mission, preserving themselves as the champion of that mission. It's almost a necessary dark art when you're the underdog. You simply can't afford sentimentality that could compromise the goal.
And being the underdog often means you can't just attack head on.
The military strategists are really clear on this. Sun Tzu is emphatic. When your forces are outnumbered, you have to avoid direct confrontation. You must eschew direct attack and rely on stratagem instead. The only path to victory is often indirect, concentrating your limited strength selectively, maybe gaining reinforcements slowly and carefully.
Clausewitz echoes this too, right? In his analysis of small war or guerrilla tactics, he notes that smaller units contribute strategically not by winning big battles, but by disrupting the enemy, hindering their reconnaissance, forcing them to spread out their forces. It's about fighting indirectly to create openings.
And this indirect approach often requires a degree of secrecy, sometimes even from your own team, your closest supporters. Sun Tzu points out that a general must often keep his own officers in the dark about the real plan.
Why? To prevent leaks?
Partly, yes, but also to prevent internal fear or disagreement from derailing things before they even start. The famous example is the General Pan Chao, who apparently divided his army in a way that deceived the enemy, but it only worked because his own troops didn't fully grasp the scheme beforehand.
So the idea is they shouldn't share in the risky planning at the start. They should just rejoice in the outcome later.
That's the principle. It implies that the strategic original sometimes has to mislead even their allies, maybe their own team, about the full scope or the exact steps of the plan. It's necessary to ensure that the radical action can actually happen without being stopped prematurely by internal resistance or fear.
Wow. Okay, so if the original champion has to navigate all this brutal honesty, extreme risk, strategic deception, maybe even self-cannibalism of past successes, what kind of person does it take? What's the character required? This brings us to part 4, the character of the leader who champions originals.
And the sources seem to converge quite strongly here, pointing towards Jim Collins' concept of level 5 leadership.
Ah, yes, level 5. That rare, almost paradoxical combination of deep personal humility and professional will. These are leaders who are incredibly ambitious, but their ambition isn't for themselves, right? It's entirely focused on the organization's long-term success.
Exactly. Think about the main example, Darwin Smith. He was the CEO who transformed Kimberly-Clark from a struggling paper company into a global leader in consumer goods like Kleenex and Huggies. But he was famously low profile, shy even. When someone asked about his management style, he just said, eccentric.
Right. The story goes he preferred hanging out with plumbers and electricians over the corporate elite. That humility, that tendency to look out the window and attribute success to luck, external factors, other people, that seems critical.
It's critical, but, and this is the paradox, that outward humility is paired with this intense, almost ferocious inner drive. When things go badly, level 5 leaders look in the mirror, they take full responsibility, and their professional will, it's fanatical. Smith made the incredibly tough, painful decision to sell off the company's original profitable paper mills, the very core of the business, to bet everything on consumer products.
That's the internal cannibalism we talked about, driven purely by professional will, not ego.
That decision, essentially destroying the company's successful past to create its future, is precisely what the champion of originality often has to do. It's about being the plow horse focused on sustained results, not the show horse looking for temporary fame.
And that fanatical drive, it really connects with Emerson's description of the truly original person, doesn't it?
It aligns perfectly. Emerson says, "The true poet, the true original, announces that which no man foretold. They stand alone, original, and pure. Their reliance is fundamentally on themselves, their own insight, not on external authority or established traditions."
What I find fascinating about Emerson's take is how he views the relationship between that original individual and the big established institutions like the state or a corporation. He says the wise statesman knows that society is actually fluid, that institutions aren't sacred or permanent, they're changeable.
It's a profoundly radical idea, really. Emerson observed that any particle, any individual, may suddenly become the center of the movement and compel the system to gyrate round it. Change doesn't start with the state leading or the corporate hierarchy deciding. It bubbles up from the progress, the innovation of the individual citizen, the individual employee.
It completely flips the usual script.
Yeah.
The most powerful, seemingly unshakable institutions, they're just the result of past human choices and actions. And because people made them, they're all, as Emerson puts it, imitable, all alterable.
And grasping that was the central challenge for Lou Gerstner when he took over IBM in the 90s. The problem wasn't that IBM lacked technology. The problem was driving deep strategic and cultural change. He had to reinvent this deeply encrusted culture from the DNA out.
Because the company was just frozen by its own history, its own success. Repeating that mantra, but we've always done it this way.
Exactly. The biggest fight was forcing that internal cannibalism, getting IBM to embrace new ways of selling, to move away from its reliance on the mainframe, even though those old ways were still profitable. It meant destroying successful existing models, which is incredibly hard for an established organization to do. It was paralyzed by institutional fear.
So the leader who champions originals has to be the one to break that spell.
They have to, and they do it by embodying that level 5 paradox, showing profound personal humility, maybe preferring the plumber's company to the board's, while simultaneously possessing that relentless, unyielding professional will. The will to commit the necessary acts of creative destruction against the status quo, to clear the ground so that the ugly baby, the original idea, actually has space to grow and mature.
Okay, let's try and wrap this up. This deep dive really highlights that being an original champion means living with and navigating some pretty intense paradoxes.
Absolutely. First, there's the need for candor. You need that ruthless critique. But that requires psychological safety, mutual respect. Yet the very act of challenging the status quo inevitably creates fear and defensiveness. So the leader has to somehow force candor, even when the whole system just wants polite, maybe even cheerful, silence.
Right. Paradox 1.
And the second.
Second, originality demands you accept that initial ideas will almost always look like ugly babies.
Yeah.
You have to embrace that non-truncated outcome distribution we talked about, understanding you'll likely have many failures, many lows, to get that one massive breakthrough. You can't just want the wins without tolerating the losses.
Makes sense. And finally,
coalition building. It seems necessary, but it's incredibly dangerous. The leader has to constantly, almost cynically, weigh the strength an alliance brings against the very real risk of negative association or losing the sharp focus of their original mission. Sometimes the ally is more dangerous than the opponent. So, ultimately, this whole discussion about the character needed to champion originality, it's not just about, say, corporate growth or innovation, is it? There are maybe deeper societal implications here. You brought up Thucydides earlier.
yes. Thucydides, writing about the Peloponnesian War, observes something chilling that happens during times of intense conflict and revolution. Language itself starts to break down. Words have to change their ordinary meaning to fit the new, extreme reality.
And the example was?
In that chaotic environment, he noted, acting with prudent hesitation, careful, principled deliberation before acting, it got redefined. It came to be seen as specious cowardice. Caution became weakness.
Wow.
So the final thought for you to consider is this. If organizations cannot cultivate a culture that genuinely tolerates creative dissent, if they can't protect the ugly baby, if caution and careful questioning are always dismissed as fear or disloyalty, are they not, perhaps unknowingly, creating the very conditions where truth itself and prudent caution start to lose all meaning?
That's quite a thought to end on. It certainly gives you something to think about the next time you hesitate to voice a difficult truth. Or maybe, just maybe, the next time you feel tempted to roll your eyes at someone else's awkward first draft idea.
Indeed. Something to chew on. We look forward to diving deeper with you again next time.